was just an ordinary Saturday morning, the kind where the sun shone a little too bright and the hum of the world felt almost tranquil. Lena Carter had always liked Saturdays, even though they marked the start of the weekend rush. Her husband Daniel had his usual weekend work, catching up on paperwork, answering emails, but Lena always had a simple plan: grocery shopping, a stop at the bakery for their daughter's favorite pastries, maybe a few minutes to herself before the chaos of family life resumed. But that Saturday, something went wrong. It started like any other. Lena kissed Daniel goodbye, pulling her jacket tight against the morning chill, the scent of fresh coffee still lingering in the kitchen. She promised their daughter Emily that she'd be back in time for lunch. She slipped out the door, and the world never saw her again. It wasn't until noon when Daniel realized something wasn't right. Lena hadn't come home. He called her cell, but it went straight to voicemail. At first, he thought she might have run into an old friend, or maybe she stopped by the gym. But as the hours stretched on, panic crept in. By mid-afternoon, he was calling her phone every 5 minutes, each ring making his pulse race faster. No answer. Daniel's heart sank when he realized that Lena's car, a sleek black sedan they'd bought a few years back, was still parked in the driveway. She never left it behind. That was when the knot of fear began to twist in his stomach. He called the police at around 3 p.m. That was when the officers first showed up, and by then things had escalated. A missing persons report was filed, and an officer, Detective Laura Collins, was assigned to the case. Daniel paced back and forth, explaining the situation to her. "She never does this. She would never just leave without telling me," he said, his voice shaking. Detective Collins was calm, but there was an underlying urgency in her eyes. She asked about Lena's last known whereabouts. "She left to go grocery shopping," Daniel explained. "She was just supposed to pick up a few things. It's not like her to vanish like this." They found Lena's purse and wallet in the car, still locked. Her phone, too, was missing, but nothing in the car seemed out of place. Detective Collins examined the car with precision, noting the absence of any obvious signs of foul play. As the investigation progressed, the situation seemed to grow more mysterious. They discovered that Lena had, in fact, stopped at the grocery store. The clerk remembered seeing her that morning, smiling as she picked out a loaf of bread and some fruit. But after that, the trail went cold. Detective Collins started canvassing the area. Neighbors, however, were of no help. Some saw nothing unusual. Others claimed they hadn't seen anything suspicious, just a normal Saturday morning. By the time night fell, Daniel was exhausted. His mind raced with terrifying possibilities. What if something had happened to her? What if someone had taken her? The officers promised to keep searching, but they were careful not to give him false hope. At the same time, there was no indication that anything foul had happened. Not yet, at least. But the feeling in Daniel's gut told him something was terribly wrong. It was around 10 p.m. when the breakthrough came. Detective Collins called Daniel, her voice terse. "We found something." When Daniel arrived at the small police station, his hands were clammy, his heart a nervous drumbeat in his chest. They led him to a small room, and there, on the table, was something Lena had left behind. A small, unassuming notebook. It was Lena's, but it wasn't something Daniel had ever seen before. "What is it?" Daniel asked, his throat tight. "It's a journal," Collins replied, her voice carefully neutral. She flipped it open, revealing pages upon pages of notes. But this wasn't just any journal. It was a list of names, places, and cryptic phrases. Names he didn't recognize, addresses he couldn't recall. Some of the entries were written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. There were even references to places Lena had never mentioned before, places that didn't exist in their town. But the most disturbing entry was one that made Daniel's blood run cold. Written in the middle of the journal, almost as if she had forgotten to hide it, was a name that sent a chill through his bones. "Daniel, do not trust anyone." The words were followed by a date, which was only a few days before her disappearance. Daniel felt his world tilt. Everything he thought he knew about Lena, everything he thought was true, was now in question. Why had she written that? What was she trying to tell him? His mind spun with all the possibilities, each darker than the last. Do not trust anyone. The words echoed in his mind as he stared at the page. What had Lena been hiding? And where was she now? The discovery of the journal was just the beginning. Daniel couldn't shake the image of those words. Do not trust anyone? They haunted him, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts like a persistent whisper. But the more he tried to understand, the more the mystery deepened. For the next few days, the investigation took on a new tone. Detective Collins and the rest of the police team began combing through Lena's life, trying to piece together what she might have been involved in before her disappearance. Each lead seemed to pull them deeper into a labyrinth of secrets, and the further they went, the more unnerving it became. The journal wasn't the only thing they found. One night, while Daniel was at the police station going over the journal with Detective Collins, one of the officers called. They had found something else, something that sent chills down Daniel's spine. It was an apartment. It wasn't on any map, and it certainly wasn't one that Daniel knew about. Yet hidden in Lena's private files, they discovered a signed lease for a second apartment in a nearby city, a place she had apparently been paying rent on for over a year. The lease was in her name, though Daniel had never seen any paperwork or had any knowledge of it. The officer on the phone explained that they'd gone to the address, hoping to find some clue as to where Lena might have been staying. The apartment was empty, but it was meticulously clean. No furniture, no personal belongings, nothing but a few basic things. A couch, a desk, a small kitchen setup, a bed, but no signs of a life lived there. It didn't make sense. Why would Lena have a secret apartment? Daniel's mind raced. It wasn't like her. She'd never mentioned anything about needing a second place. Could this be where she had been hiding? Had she planned to leave him? To run away? The questions bubbled up, but the answers were elusive. The following day, Daniel visited the apartment himself. The place was eerie in its simplicity. So clean, so stark, it felt like someone was trying to keep it as empty as possible. The lack of any personal touches was unsettling, almost as if it was a place of escape. But from what? As he stepped into the small kitchen, his eyes were drawn to the counter. A small, unmarked envelope lay there. The moment Daniel picked it up, he could feel the weight of the paper. The texture was different, almost too sleek for something as mundane as a letter. Inside, there was a burner phone, the kind you would buy without leaving a trace. A phone that had never been connected to any service in his name or Lena's. Daniel stared at it for a long moment, the air thick with tension. This wasn't something Lena would have done. It didn't make sense. Why would she need a burner phone? He pocketed it carefully, knowing it could hold the key to answers he desperately needed. Back at the police station, Detective Collins had a few more revelations to share. They had traced Lena's financial transactions, trying to uncover any irregularities. That's when they found another shock. Lena had been transferring large sums of money, sometimes thousands of dollars, into an offshore bank account. The account didn't belong to anyone Daniel knew. It had been opened in another name, one he didn't recognize. But there was no doubt about it. The transfers were connected to Lena's account. She'd been making these deposits for several months, and the most recent transaction had occurred just days before she disappeared. It was clear now. Lena had been hiding something big. She had been preparing for something, and whatever it was, she hadn't wanted anyone to find out. The more Daniel thought about the situation, the more his mind twisted in knots. Who was she really? What kind of life had she been living when he wasn't around? Had she been planning to disappear, or was she hiding from someone? From something? Detective Collins sat across from him, watching him carefully. Daniel, I need to ask you something. Did you know about this apartment? The phone? The money transfers? Daniel shook his head, his voice shaking. No, I swear I had no idea. Her expression hardened. The thing is, we're not just dealing with a missing person case anymore. This is starting to look like something much darker. We have to consider all possibilities, including that someone else might be involved. For the first time in days, Daniel allowed himself to entertain that thought. Was someone else behind this? Was Lena involved with someone or something he didn't know about? The more Detective Collins spoke, the more Daniel felt like the walls were closing in. He thought he knew his wife, but now he was starting to question everything. The Lena he thought he knew seemed to be slipping further away with each passing minute. Then, just as Daniel was beginning to lose hope, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. The police had managed to track the burner phone's last known activity. The phone had been used to send a single text message, a message sent to a man named Thomas Wilder, a name that meant nothing to Daniel. Detective Collins was already working on finding out who this Thomas Wilder was. But one thing was clear. Lena had been in contact with someone, a man apparently, right before she disappeared. This wasn't just about a missing housewife anymore. This was about a double life, one that Daniel had never known existed. Before I continue the story, make sure to like and subscribe our channel for more chilling content. The name Thomas Wilder echoed in Daniel's mind as if it had been carved there. Every time he tried to think of his wife, Lena, he couldn't shake the image of her secret life, a life she had kept hidden from him. The burner phone, the secret apartment, the unexplained money transfers, and now this Thomas Wilder, it all seemed to be spiraling into something unthinkable. Who was he? Daniel couldn't stand the thought of Lena being involved with someone else, let alone someone who might have been a reason for her disappearance. He knew he needed answers, and he needed them fast. Detective Collins had already started working on finding this Thomas Wilder, and it didn't take long for her to dig up information. The man was local, though not from the same town as Daniel and Lena. Wilder lived about an hour away in a neighboring city, a place where Daniel had never heard of him. Wilder was listed as an unemployed man with a series of odd jobs. But what struck Detective Collins as strange were the links to a small but notorious gang that had been in the area several years ago. They were involved in a series of smuggling operations and other criminal activities, but the gang had disbanded after a series of arrests. However, Wilder had a history. He had been arrested once for assault but never convicted. That arrest had been tied to a case of domestic violence, though the woman had refused to press charges. The more they dug into his background, the more troubling things became. He didn't have much of a record, but his connections to shady individuals were enough to make Detective Collins suspicious. By the end of the week, they had tracked down Wilder to a dilapidated apartment building just outside of town. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect someone like Lena to frequent, but there it was, the link between her and him. Daniel wasn't sure if he was ready for the truth, but he had to face it. He had to find out who Thomas Wilder was to truly understand what happened to his wife. Detective Collins arranged for a covert visit to Wilder's apartment. She wasn't sure if he was directly involved in Lena's disappearance, but they needed to talk to him, especially after they discovered a string of unsolved cases involving women who had disappeared in the same area where he had lived. As Daniel and Collins approached the apartment building, a sickening feeling gnawed at Daniel's insides. It felt like they were walking into a trap, but there was no turning back. They had come this far. Wilder's apartment was tucked away on the second floor, and when they knocked, it took a few moments before he answered the door. He was tall, lean, and his face bore the remnants of a life spent on the wrong side of the law. Sharp features, a hollow gaze, and a weathered expression. "Detective Collins," he said, almost with a hint of surprise. "What can I do for you?" His tone was cordial enough, but Daniel could sense something off about him. There was an underlying tension in the air, like a predator sizing up its prey. "We need to ask you a few questions about Lena Carter," Collins said, keeping her voice steady. At the mention of Lena's name, Wilder stiffened. His eyes flickered to Daniel, and something in his gaze sent a chill down Daniel's spine. It wasn't just guilt. It was something darker, something more calculated. "Never heard of her," Wilder said, though his voice faltered for a moment. But Collins wasn't buying it. "We've traced calls and messages from a burner phone that was used by Lena. Your name came up." Wilder's expression hardened, and for a moment Daniel thought he might shut the door on them, but instead he leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Look, I don't know what you think you've got, but I'm not the one you're looking for." Daniel felt a surge of anger. "What do you know about my wife? Where is she? What did you do to her?" Wilder didn't flinch. He crossed his arms, his voice low. "Your wife, huh? You think I'm some kind of monster? I don't know where she is. I don't know anything about your life, buddy." But something in the way he said it made Daniel uneasy. There was a hint of something more in Wilder's voice, a mocking tone as though he was enjoying watching Daniel unravel. Before the situation could escalate any further, Collins stepped forward. "We know you're lying. We'll be back with a warrant if we have to." Wilder gave a brief chuckle before he turned and walked back into the apartment, closing the door firmly behind him. The encounter left Daniel reeling. Wilder's cold demeanor, his refusal to admit any involvement, only deepened Daniel's suspicion. There was something about the way he carried himself, something that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. Over the next few days, the investigation went quiet, but then a new lead came through. Police had managed to track down a witness who claimed to have seen Lena and a man matching Wilder's description together at a local cafe just a week before her disappearance. The witness said the two had been sitting at a secluded corner, speaking in hushed tones, and seemed to be in the middle of an intense conversation. This was the breakthrough Daniel needed. Lena had been in contact with Wilder, and it wasn't just random. The tension between them had been palpable, and the witness swore that it had seemed like a meeting of equals, not some random encounter. The pieces were finally starting to come together, but with them came more disturbing questions. What was Lena involved in? Was she running from something, or was she trying to escape someone? Had she been involved with Wilder in a way that Daniel could never have imagined? And most importantly, where was she now? The pieces of Lena's life no longer fit together in any way Daniel understood. The woman he had married, the mother of his child, had been keeping secrets so dark that even the police were struggling to piece them together. The connection to Thomas Wilder wasn't just a coincidence. It was deliberate. Lena had met with him, she had been involved with him, and now she was missing. But missing didn't mean dead. Daniel refused to believe she was gone forever. The break in the case came 6 days later. Detective Collins received a traffic camera hit. Lena's car had been spotted outside a remote motel nearly 40 miles from home. The timestamp? The night before she vanished. Daniel's stomach churned as they pulled into the gravel lot of the rundown motel. The neon vacancy sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow against the damp pavement. This wasn't just some random stop. Lena had come here for a reason. The motel clerk, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, squinted at the photograph of Lena. "Yeah, I remember her," he muttered. "Checked in late, paid in cash, didn't want any questions." Daniel's pulse quickened. "Did she leave with someone?" The clerk scratched his chin. "Nah, left alone." But she was scared, kept looking over her shoulder, like she thought someone was following her. That was all they needed. Room 206, Lena's last known location. The police forced the door open. The room was empty, but it was clear someone had stayed there. The bed was unmade, the air stale. Daniel's gaze landed on the only thing left behind, a single folded note on the nightstand. He snatched it up, hands shaking as he unfolded the paper. "Daniel, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. I had to go. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't put you in danger. Please, don't look for me. Don't trust anyone, not even the police. Lena." His vision blurred as the words sank in. She hadn't been taken. She had run. Detective Collins read the note twice, her jaw tightening. "She's alive," she said finally, "but she's in trouble." Daniel swallowed hard. What was she running from? Collins exhaled. "I think it's time you know everything." They sat in the police station that night, the walls feeling as though they were closing in on Daniel. "Lena wasn't just some housewife with a double life," Collins began. "She was part of something bigger and much more dangerous." Daniel gritted his teeth. "What are you talking about?" Collins slid a confidential file across the table. "We ran deeper checks on Thomas Wilder. He wasn't just some low-level thug. He was involved in trafficking operations, drugs, weapons, and people. We believe Lena wasn't working with him." She paused. "We think she was working against him." The air left Daniel's lungs. "Lena was a whistleblower," Collins continued. "She was gathering evidence on Wilder and his old crew. The money, the offshore account? We believe it was part of a plan. She was trying to get someone out, someone she cared about, someone Wilder had taken." Daniel's mind reeled. "Who?" Collins hesitated. "We don't know, But whatever happened, she must have gotten too close. Wilder either found out or she realized she was being watched. That's why she ran. Daniel clenched his fists. So where is she now? Collins shook her head. We don't know, but I do know this. If Wilder thinks she's still alive, he won't stop looking for her. And now that we've been poking around, she met Daniel's gaze. He knows you're looking for her too. That night, Daniel sat in his darkened home. Lena's note clenched in his hands. She was alive, but she was running from something he couldn't see. And if the police were right, if Thomas Wilder truly was the man they said he was, then Lena was in more danger than he had ever imagined. And so was he. The weight of the situation pressed down on Daniel with suffocating force. Lena was out there somewhere, alive but on the run. She had tried to warn him, to keep him safe, but he couldn't just sit back and wait. She was his wife. He couldn't let her face whatever she was running from alone. That night, after leaving the police station, Daniel made a decision. He couldn't trust anyone else to find her. He had to do it himself. Daniel's first step was to retrace Lena's last known movements. He drove back to the motel where she had stayed. The clerk had been helpful, but he had no new information. The police had combed the area, but no one had seen Lena since she left the motel. Daniel wasn't about to give up, though. He knew that if he could get to Wilder, he might find the answers he was desperate for. Wilder had to know where she was, and there was no way he was going to let him out of his grasp. The next morning, Daniel took another look at the folder Detective Collins had given him, the file on Thomas Wilder. He scoured it, searching for any clue, any hint that might lead him to the man. Then at the bottom of the file, something caught his eye. A location. It was an old warehouse abandoned for years, located on the outskirts of the city. There had been reports of strange activity there. Lights at odd hours, strange people coming and going. Wilder's name had been linked to it. It was the perfect place to find him. Daniel arrived at the warehouse just after dusk. The sky was a dark purple, the air thick with tension. He parked his car a few blocks away and walked the rest of the way, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The warehouse loomed ahead, a silhouette against the darkening sky. The door was cracked open, and the faintest sliver of light spilled out. Daniel's heart raced as he crept closer, every step a calculated risk. He had no backup, no team. He had no idea what he was walking into, but the fear of losing Lena again pushed him forward. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, filled with the scent of oil and rust. There was an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of metal and the faint hum of machinery. Then a sound, a voice. "Did you really think you could find her?" Daniel froze. It was Wilder's voice. "Where is she?" Daniel demanded, his voice barely a whisper, but loud enough to echo through the cavernous space. Wilder's figure stepped from the shadows, his face half hidden by the low light. "You should have stayed out of this. She made her choice." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. "Tell me where she is, Wilder." Wilder's lips curled into a smirk. "I don't think you understand. Lena wasn't just trying to escape me. She was trying to destroy everything I built." "That's not true," Daniel shouted, stepping closer. "She was trying to protect someone, wasn't she? Someone you were hurting. Tell me where she is, or I swear." Wilder's eyes narrowed. "You don't know anything about her, about the things she had to do, about the people she had to betray." "Don't lie to me," Daniel spat. "I know the truth. Now tell me where she is." Wilder's expression darkened. "You really don't want to go any further, Daniel. Trust me." But before Daniel could react, a gunshot rang out, echoing off the walls of the warehouse. Daniel froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Wilder had pulled a gun from under his jacket. The barrel was pointed directly at him. "Stay back," Wilder warned, his voice cold and steady. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Daniel didn't move. He couldn't. Not now. Not when he was so close. "Where is she, Wilder?" Wilder's eyes flicked to something behind Daniel, a shadow moving in the dark. Before Daniel could react, Lena stepped into the light. She looked different, more worn, more guarded. Her eyes locked on Daniel, and for a moment, there was only silence. "Lena ... Daniel whispered, his voice shaking. She took a step toward him, her hands held out in a gesture of peace. "Daniel, you need to leave." This isn't you anymore. It's too dangerous. Wilder took a step forward. You think I'm going to let you take him with you? This isn't your fight anymore, Lena. Lena looked at Daniel, her face filled with regret. It was never supposed to go this far. I didn't want you involved. I thought I could fix things. I was wrong. Daniel reached for her. Lena, I don't care about what happened. I care about you. I don't care what you did. I just need to know you're safe. But before she could respond, Wilder moved, aiming his gun at them both. No more talking. It's over, he snarled. Everything happened in a blur. Daniel dove toward Lena, knocking her to the ground as a second gunshot rang out. The force of the shot made him stagger, but it hadn't hit him. It had missed. Lena screamed, "Run!" Daniel didn't think twice. He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the exit. They sprinted through the dark, Wilder's voice echoing behind them as he chased after them. But they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. They reached Daniel's car, breathless and shaking. He slammed the door shut behind them, starting the engine and speeding off into the night. The lights of the warehouse faded behind them, leaving only the road ahead. As they drove, Lena's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, Daniel. I never wanted you to find out like this. Daniel reached out and took her hand. We'll figure this out. Together. Lena nodded, squeezing his hand. I don't know if we can outrun what's coming, but we have to try. As they sped into the unknown, Daniel realized one thing. This wasn't just about finding Lena. It was about fighting for her, no matter the cost. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he was not alone, and that was enough to keep going.